Hello. So this week we're going to be starting out with the kind of introductory question of why does identity matter? And the follow-up to that, does it actually matter? So to start off, I want you to spend a couple of minutes looking at a couple cartoons. So these first few slides are going to have different cartoons that all relate to the ways that we learn, why we learn, how the school system kind of interacts with that learning and impacts it. So take a couple minutes, look at these cartoons, see what you think, see if you can apply them to your own life experiences. So one of the first main concepts we're going to be looking at comes from this man on the screen here, Paulo Freire. He was a Brazilian educator and philosopher who really brought about the concept of critical pedagogy. And so you can read this more detailed description on the screen now, but critical pedagogy is essentially the idea that we should go beneath the surface. So when we see something, we should try to think more deeply about it. We should try to examine power structures, traditional wisdom, norms, things like that we see to kind of better understand them and how do they actually impact us day to day. And we're talking about this idea of critical pedagogy because it relates to education and really the act of learning more broadly. It says that social justice or democracy are not distinct from the teaching and learning process. So to be involved in society, you have to be aware of how you're learning and how you're being taught. And so the goal of this kind of reconsideration of our circumstances or this looking deeper is something called conscientização. I apologize for my Portuguese there. But the essence of that is emancipation from oppression through your critical thinking. So I know that for years you've heard about the value of critical thinking, and this is kind of what it's meant to be. It's the freedom from traditional structures or bounds that might be holding you back from something. And so this is important when we're looking at the idea of identity because outside factors shape who we can become, right? So your teaching, your learning, everything that you've experienced has shaped your personality to some extent. And so it shapes some people more, others less, but there's always going to be some sort of impact. And then that also impacts the society that we live in, right? So this kind of greater understanding of why we've become the way we are because of the systems that we live within can also impact how we behave in the wider world, how we shape what's around us, how we engage with what's around us. So one of the options for assignments this week is to read the chapter from Paulo Freire. So actually everybody should be reading the chapter, but you'll choose whether to respond to that or the podcast that you should be listening to. And so if you decide to respond to the Freire reading, think about what does it mean to be oppressed? Think about if you've ever experienced oppression. Have you ever escaped oppression? These are the sorts of things I want you to be considering. And so you may be able to make some connections back to those cartoons from earlier, or maybe there's other things in your life that you could connect to this reading. And so a key takeaway from this is the concept of the banking model of education. So hopefully you can see how that connects to those cartoons from earlier and to the reading from Freire. But in essence here is the teachers are taking the information and they're pouring it into the learners. And so there's a certain kind of dynamic that is created or supported by this idea. Essentially, the teachers have all of the wisdom and they're putting it into you. And so it's a very one-way sort of relationship where the teacher knows, or here you can see the teacher teaches and the students are taught. The students aren't teaching back, right? So there's not that sort of cyclical relationship. It's very much a one-way. And if you think back to some of those cartoons, it's like teaching to the test, right? Why did you have to learn this? Because it's on the exam. So think about if you've had those sorts of experiences in your life and think about if those have been the most rewarding experiences. Or maybe you've had other experiences where the teacher talks and the teacher listens, right? So that way the teacher is kind of engaging with more of a back and forth environment where the students are also contributing and they're bringing learning to the environment as well. So we don't always see this. Our system of education and most others around the world, I would say probably all formal education around the world, has really related to this banking model of education. There are some instances or some times where maybe it's going to be more of a back and forth, but usually the teacher kind of holds the power in the classroom and the students just have to respond to that. So take a moment and read this quote. The more completely the majority adapt to the purposes which the dominant minority prescribe for them, the more easily the minority can continue to prescribe. The theory and practice of banking education serves this end quite efficiently. So essentially, the people in power are able to keep the power because they have the power, right? So if we kind of look at this in the context of the banking system, you can see that the banking approach pretty much ignores prior knowledge and background, understanding, skills, interests, and learners' thoughts and their creative powers or their agency become inhibited or stay inhibited because they don't have the power in the situation, right? So this is, when we see the status quo being upheld, that's what this is. Have you seen this before? Does this look familiar to anybody? Hopefully you can see that this is the map, right? These are the continents that we have just switched upside down. So I'm going to show you guys a short clip from the TV show The West Wing. If you haven't seen it, you should. But so this is going to be looking at how perception influences things. So just really broadly, why do our different perceptions matter? And we can think about how that is shaped by the input that we're receiving from our instructors, from our teachers. All right, so here are a couple different maps, right? So we're all familiar with the Mercator projection, but we see all these other alternatives as well. So think about, what do the different perceptions of a map mean, right? How do they relate to power? How do they relate to control structures? Why is there benefit to the map being the way it is now for us versus another form for us or for another place in the country or the world, right? Try to think about the differences there. What does the visual representation mean? How does it impact our control or lack of control? So hopefully that gives you both a good view on perception and also inspiration to go watch The West Wing after this. If that's the only thing you take away from this semester, I will be happy. But so try to think about how your perception of things is impacted by your place in the world like this, right? So we, being in the US, in the Northern Hemisphere, we benefit from the map as it largely exists in practice today. So think about what it would mean if we were in a different position on the map, if we didn't have that central positioning, we didn't have the power, the eye wasn't automatically drawn to it. Think about how that could shape our global impact. The US is a superpower. If we were actually, a tiny little thing at the bottom of the map here, like we kind of blend into Canada on this one, right? So think about how that might shape the power that we hold around the world. How does that relate to your identity, right? Coming from the US, we all have kind of an innate identity of power, really, because we are from what has, at least for the past several decades, been the most powerful country in the world. Maybe we're seeing that start to be questioned more, but still we have a pretty safe positioning being involved in one of the top universities in the United States. That gives us a little bit of an element of control or of power. So how does that shape your identity, do you think? And so in addition to the short Paulo Freire chapter that you're reading for this week, you're also listening to this podcast. So if you choose to respond to the podcast in your post for the week, think about these questions. What are some roles that you've played? What are roles that people have asked you to play? What are roles maybe that you've refused to play? And then how does purpose, or how does this role assignment relate to identity really broadly? Hopefully you guys know who the people are in this podcast. Urkel from Family Matters, really big part of my childhood. If you don't know that, it's another TV show you should go back and watch after you finish The West Wing. So yeah, think about these questions maybe even before you start listening to the podcast, so you can take down some notes and be prepared to speak on your presentation. So that's it for the kind of lecture for this week. So hopefully that wasn't too painful. Hopefully all of that made sense. As always, if you have any questions, please email me and let me know.